Hi, everybody. Shelley Chelman with History 705, our discussion post for the week. So I am focusing on how the level of historical trustworthiness is determined based on the audience that you are presenting the material to. And this discussion actually grew out of the work from Lyon, Nix, and Schrum from week 1 in chapter 1 and 2 from the Introduction to Public History. And in that reading for that first week, there is a chart on page 4, and that chart broke down how trustworthy people thought historians were in different settings, from museums to college to high school. It included firsthand accounts and people that were family members who had shared historical information with the person, all the way down to TV shows. And what was really shocking to me was the level of trustworthiness, or the low level of trustworthiness that people attributed to high school history teachers. And we're going to get into that a little bit deeper. I have actually been a high school history teacher for the past 16 years and currently still do, although I also teach as an adjunct professor of history at a local community college. And so I think what struck me about this is that being a trained educator, we were always taught to develop personal relationships with our students, appropriate levels of personal relationships with our students, making sure that we maintain those professional and appropriate boundaries. And that doing so allows students to understand and relate to the content better, and also it lessens classroom management issues. So when I read this chart and really started thinking about it, the first thing that occurred to me was that when you go into a museum, you do not know the docent or the historian or the guide who is walking you through and providing historical background and knowledge and information to you as you journey through the museum. But yet, when we have students, whether it be in a college classroom or a high school classroom, we're with them longer, we develop a rapport, hopefully, with them, and then at the same time, we're also introducing new information. And so what that really did was to cause me to pause and to question the different benefits, or the supposed presumed benefits, of developing that rapport with students. So when I go in on the first day of school, I begin to try to subtly, not overtly, attempt to build a rapport and a connection with my students. And I put an example here, although there are tons of writings that support the idea of developing a rapport with your audience, whether that audience is legitimately an audience, such as you would find in a museum, or if it is a classroom. And so really I began to kind of question just how is it that a historian in a museum that has assumed no prior or deeper history with this person other than they chose to walk into the museum that particular day, just how is it that they are deemed to be more trustworthy in their presentation and their knowledge of history? So it got me to wondering, is it really so much the historian itself, or is it a combination between the audience that we are addressing and their interest level in the subject or the setting that we're presenting the material. So when you think about it in that context, students, whether they are college students or high school students, a lot of times they're just checking a box. So they're just fulfilling a graduation requirement, and they're somewhat of a captive audience. You know, they sometimes they look at history as, well, I just have to suck it up and make it through this class. And so that got me to thinking that perhaps it isn't necessarily who is presenting the content, the historical knowledge. It is, what is their motivation for being there? And I think we can agree that our motivation for going into a museum is going to be significantly different than our motivation for walking into a high school or college classroom. And so I think it's that motivation for the reason behind why they have become the historian's audience that really makes a difference in how they view that historian. And that tied into the quote that I have on the screen here from Michel Rolf Trullo. I'm hoping I'm not killing his name, Silencing the Past. And what he wrote about was historical representations, be they books, commercial exhibits, or public commemorations, cannot be conceived only as vehicles for the transmission of knowledge. They must establish some relation to that knowledge. And that really tied into what I was already kind of struggling with, and the idea of teachers, people who are intentionally presenting the material with the desire and responsibility of you learning that material. And so when he wrote, they must establish some relation to that knowledge, that's where it really kind of became clear to me. You can personally develop a rapport with your audience, your students, but they also need to have a connection to the knowledge, the content that you are imparting. And it's that difference and that level of knowledge and understanding, I think, that really lends itself to their interpretation of just how trustworthy you are as a historian. And so those two concepts kind of go together. It's not enough to just have a relationship with the teacher or the professor, but it's also helping students to engage with the content that we're teaching to help them, assist them in feeling connected, not to you necessarily or singularly, but to the content as a whole. So based on this chart, I am not advocating that developing student relationships isn't equally important, but I think what we need to do, and obviously this is an ongoing battle for all historians, whether you're a teacher, a professor, working in a museum, it really doesn't matter, but it's helping your audience, whoever that might be, to connect with history, to engage with history. And I think that that's, especially in the day and age that we're living in, it is extremely difficult to get people to really understand things such as the significance of the Declaration of Independence or the importance of the Constitution. And so without getting political, which I would rather try to avoid, the point is still that unless our audience has some kind of interest in what we are teaching, it really, I think, equally important to that is that they develop a relationship with their educator. So I think it needs to be twofold, especially when you're in a setting, in a school where people haven't necessarily chosen to be there as they are in a museum, but that they are required to be there, for lack of a better word, and getting over that hump and still getting them to engage with our content. So obviously, this is one chart and one study, but it's significant. It really touched on something for me personally, because I've always worked hard at developing a rapport with my students, and I think I need to refocus and work equally hard in getting them to also really engage with the subject that I'm teaching. So thank you all for listening, and I would love to hear your feedback. Have a good day.